Welcome back to What Makes That Ticker Tick. This is the show where we tackle about 10 key questions around a specific ticker in 10 minutes or less. The ticker today, CEFX. It is the SNET Composite Closed-End Fund Index. It's a mutual fund index. It's a little bit different than what we've talked about on the show in the past. My guest today is none other than Associate Director of Research at VettaFi, Roxanna Islam, joining us live from Dallas. Roxanna, how are you doing today?
I'm good, John.
Thank you for joining us. I'm most excited to double click on CEFX today with you on what makes that ticker tick. We're going to talk about index use cases. We're going to cover index construction. We're going to dive into performance. And then last but not least, we're going to go into my favorite part of this show, what's inside. What are some of the constituencies, some of the names inside this particular index? Roxanna, let's start with what is the objective or the investment case behind the index CEFX? Over to you.
Yeah, so CEFX serves as a benchmark for the taxable closed-end fund universe, which is basically everything except the tax-exempt portion of the market, and those are the municipal bond closed-end funds. And if you don't know a lot about closed-end funds, these typically have a primary objective of generating income. So these tend to have distribution rates in the high single-digit to low double-digit range, so pretty significant distributions there. So an ETF that tracks an index like CEFX would be good for an investor who maybe wants that stable income stream, but maybe isn't too familiar with closed-end funds and isn't comfortable picking individual funds, or maybe even for an experienced closed-end fund investor who wants to use this as sort of a core closed-end fund holding in their portfolio.
Sounds like it could be an incredibly convenient holding if you don't want to do all the other work, but you just want that exposure. Staying on index use cases, Roxanna, at a high level, what makes the CEFX index different than other like products in the marketplace?
Yeah, so it's a really small peer group. So there's actually only a couple of other pure closed-end fund indexes that support ETFs. So the first is the SNET Closed-End Fund Municipal Bond Index, CEFMX. So this is very similar to CEFX, very similar methodology, except it benchmarks the missing portion of that market, which is the tax-exempt or municipal bond portion. Maybe a little bit of a closer peer is the ISE High Income Index, which is ticker YLDA. This is similar yet different because it focuses more on selecting closed-end funds with high distribution rates and appreciation potential rather than trying to benchmark the entire universe. So this one, for instance, has a max of 45 constituents versus the 110 that are currently in CEFX.
Gotcha. Great segue, because I want to talk about index construction next. What is the starting universe of the index? You just mentioned that it gets down to 110 constituents, but like, what's the starting universe?
Yeah, so there's actually only 450 closed-end funds in the US, and then over 100 of those are municipal bond closed-end funds. And then here we're looking at a couple of main areas, and that's taxable fixed income, which includes both high yield and investment grade, and also equity option income. So after you take all those out, that's about a couple of hundred of closed-end funds to choose from. So still a pretty sizable universe.
Moving through index construction, what are some of the factors used to select companies for inclusion in this particular benchmark?
So this is where I think it gets a little bit interesting because the index does screen for things like minimum market cap and minimum trading value, things you would expect, but there's some really interesting industry-specific factors as well. So funds are limited to a max of 1.25 to 1.5% management fee, and that sort of depends on whether they're a current constituent or a new constituent. And this is because when this index is translated into an ETF, it uses a fund of fund structures. So you have that additional management fee for the ETF on top of those fund expenses. So what this rule does is it really tries to minimize that acquired fund expense fee so that the investor isn't paying, a crazy amount of expense for this particular product. And then another cool thing that it does is it excludes any closed-end fund that's trading at a significant premium. And it also gives a higher weight to closed-end funds that trade at a wider discount. So this is really cool because it actually replicates a popular trading strategy that managers have where they buy at low discounts and sell at high premiums.
Interesting. It holds investment grade fixed income closed end funds. It holds high yield fixed income closed end funds, and then also option income closed end funds. How often is it rebalanced or reconstituted?
So it's rebalanced and reconstituted quarterly, which I think sort of gives it more of an active feel compared to its competitor. So I mentioned YLDA earlier. So that one's only rebalanced and reconstituted semi-annually. And I actually like that quarterly schedule better for this particular index because that premium discount mechanism that closed-end funds have can be volatile. So it's nice to be a little bit more hands-on with that.
I want to pivot to performance measurements. And I recognize, given the three main sectors that underpin this index, challenged environment. Roxanna, how has performance been year to date? And then talk me through some of the environments where this index would perform very well versus the challenged one that we're in right now.
Yeah, so unfortunately, a high rising rate interest rate environment is the most difficult for closed-end funds. So right now, total return has been about flat year to date, and that's pretty standard across the whole industry, not just for this index that we've seen that performance suffer. About 2/3 of closed-end funds within the closed-end fund universe use leverage. That's typically in the form of preferred shares. So if you think about it, when you see rates start rising, the cost of borrowing is also higher. And then that sort of eats into those closed-end fund profits and could potentially lead to distribution cuts. But from an index perspective, I think that's a little bit less likely to be significant because you are diversifying across strategies, across managers, and across individual funds. And also, if you consider the actual distribution rate, which is pretty important for closed-end funds because they pay out their gains as income, that distribution rate has still been about close to 11% in the past 12 months. So in a way, distributions are pretty important for closed-end funds relative to total return because a well-managed closed-end fund may be able to weather some of that total return deterioration and maintain that stable income stream in the short term.
I like it. Roxanna, we're going to move on to my favorite section of what makes that ticker tick, what's inside. Can you talk about some of the constituents of the index, CEFX, the SNET Composite Closed-End Fund Index? Like, what are some of the constituents inside this particular benchmark?
Yeah, so it's pretty diversified, and that's, as I said, in terms of sector, in terms of manager, in terms of individual funds. So it's about 50% option income, 30% high yield, and 20% investment grade. And then it's even further diversified among managers. So some of the big managers found in this index include BlackRock, Eaton Vance, Nuveen. So when you look in the top holdings, you see these top managers reflected. And then you have some of the largest and most popular closed-end funds like EXG, BIGZ, and JPS. Like I said, these are all big, popular closed-end funds with significant distribution rates.
What about some of the lesser known constituents? Like everybody knows BlackRock, world's largest asset manager, phenomenal shop, but what are some of the lesser known constituents in this index?
Yeah, so I like some of the floating rate funds in this index because I think these are pretty appealing in this sort of environment that we're in with the rising rates. And all the big names that you mentioned, you and I mentioned, like BlackRock, Eaton Vance, Nuveen, they all have floating rate products in this index. But there's also some smaller ones in there, like the Pioneer Floating Rate Fund, which is ticker PHD, and the First Trust Senior Floating Rate Income Fund, which is ticker FCT. So these are smaller funds that have distribution rates in the low double-digit range. So I think these are closed-end funds that an investor maybe doing their own research might miss in favor of some of these larger names that we mentioned.
Gotcha. All right, Roxanna, that's the end of what makes that ticker tick, specifically for the ticker CEFX, the SNET Composite Closed-End Fund Index. I want to have you back on the show. I think you did a phenomenal job today. You pick the ticker, I'll pick the questions. I'll see you next time. Thank you, Roxanna.
Right, thanks.